In the face of these stories on the mountaintop of Jesus shining like no one can ever shine, in the face of Peter who stammers out whatever comes to mind first and sticks his foot firmly in his mouth, in the face of a voice of thunder that rattles from the cloud, it's Andrew that I am most curious about. Andrew, the one who's not there on the mountaintop. Because Andrew is the one who's been with Jesus all this time. Andrew, who was there on the beach with his brother Peter and was called out of the boat to go and fish for people. Andrew, who pitched in with this wandering teacher named Jesus. And Andrew, who has been there all along when not only pitching in his tent with this Jesus, but when the demons started shouting, Andrew was there. And when the people started to come because they were sick, and Andrew was there. As Jesus began to touch lepers who should never be touched, Andrew was there. And as Jesus taught and began to argue with the temple scribes and lawyers, Andrew was there. And I wonder about Andrew because today he gets left behind. Just 6 days ago, it was just 6 days ago that what Jesus was saying to them began to change. And just 6 days ago, for the first time, Jesus started talking about death. And it's always hard whenever a loved one starts talking about dying. That's hard for us all. But Jesus was saying something more terrifying. Because he was talking about arrest, betrayal, beatings, dying. And then, as though the Romans didn't know enough how to get rid of people who were inconvenient for them, he talked about something beyond that death, about something about rising. And Andrew, throughout all this time, was hanging on, trying to understand and constantly feeling like there's something that he's just not getting, that there's some key to what Jesus was saying that he just somehow didn't have. Just 6 days ago, Jesus started to scare them, and good old Peter, Andrew's brother, Peter, of course, the one who then tried to argue Jesus into the plain sense of Scripture that no, God surely doesn't work that way. And just 6 days ago, that Jesus had to call Peter a devil and tell him to get out of his way. And now here on the foot of this mountain, Andrew is watching his brother Peter climb up with James and John, with Jesus, as though he's a little boy being led down to the principal's office. And Andrew has to stand and watch as Jesus and the three dwindle as they climb up ever how higher until they're out of sight on the top of this mountain. And Andrew and the disciples look to each other. It is always hard to wait when we don't know what's going on, isn't it? It's always hard when we don't understand what Jesus is up to. When God's plan is not clear to us, or when we think we know what it is, but there seem to be some hints that God might have something more in mind for us. It's always hard to wait. And that's where Andrew is this day. And even when the summer storm comes rolling in, and the thunder starts echoing around the top of that mountain, all they can do is wait. And I wonder about Andrew, because that's so hard. It's so hard to be in that in-between space. It's so hard when we know what has been, even if it had some uncomfortable bits, but we don't know what's coming up next. That transition point is so hard for us as we strive to be faithful. And then I wonder about Andrew as Jesus came back. Jesus who looked the same. Jesus always is the same, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But Peter came back ashen-faced, trembling. And when Andrew sidled up to him and asked, "What happened up there?" could only shake his head. But Andrew watched his brother and began to notice that as they continued on the way, as they continued from town to town, as they continued, that Peter was listening a little more carefully. Peter was hanging on Jesus' words just that little bit more. He was walking just that little bit closer, just that little bit more attentive to what Jesus was saying, trying just that little bit harder to hear and understand what Jesus was saying. And what I wonder about Andrew is, I wonder which impressed him and scared him more. Was it the power Jesus showed to cast out demons? Or was it the power to make his tempestuous, hot-headed, impatient brother actually listen? Was it the power to heal lepers? Or to change, to transform his brother? And so I wonder about Andrew. Now, whenever we read Scripture, we always should be asking, God, what is it you want to say to us, to me, through this? Through these old living stories that have been handed down to us through these thousands of years. We read them not because they're history, but because that's where God speaks to what's happening in our lives today. And so today, with Andrew, we ask, God, what is it that you want to say to us today? And there are two things that God is saying. The first is that reminder that just as with Peter, who was transformed by seeing who Jesus really is, Jesus doesn't change. He's simply showing who he's always been. And Peter himself gets transformed by that, and then after Easter becomes the leader of a world-changing religion. Just as Peter is transformed by encountering Jesus, that's what God is up to in us too. God's mission in the world is to transform lives. God's work in the world is to transform us into who He made and intended us to be. And for that mission, God has given a church, a congregation, gathered at the corner of Campbell and Vale Park, named after his son, where Christ changes lives. That is why we are here, and the whole reason for our existence, that Christ changes lives in and through the mission and ministry of this place. And as we know in the history and in the life of a community in mission, what we call a congregation, along with the faithful people who gather in mission and for the life of the world, God calls shepherds and sets them aside to serve the mission that we share. And in our history as a congregation, we've had several. Pastor Lindblom, who founded us. Pastor Castleman, who served us. Myself, who has come among you for almost 2 years now. And then today, for the first time ever, we as a congregation will have 2 pastors as we install Pastor Erica. Now, as you know, we are not calling Pastor Erica because she's wonderful, although she certainly is. And we are not calling Pastor Erica because God has used her leadership in such significant ways as we had to wait in that transition point when it's so hard to see and wait for what Jesus is up to, although the Lord certainly has done that. But if those were the only reasons why we are calling Pastor Erica, we are doing nothing more than building a booth on top of the mountaintop because we want to come back and recreate the past. But we are calling Pastor Erica because together we've prayed. Together we've listened. And together we have heard God saying that for the sake of His mission through this place, we believe that now is the time to have two shepherds serving among us. And together we have prayed and listened, and we have come to believe that Erica Gibson even is that second shepherd that God has lifted up to us. And so, for the sake of God's work in the world, for the sake of transforming lives, for the sake of what Jesus is up to, together we get to call Pastor Erica Gibson even and get rid of that word interim. And the second thing that God is saying to us in this scripture today through this gospel is that Jesus doesn't stay on the mountaintop. Jesus always comes down. Just as Peter, James, and John, who have seen him shine, just as they, despite Peter's bright idea to put up booths so we can always come back and we'll hang out up here, and Jesus, you can hang out with these two and we'll be able to come back and visit whenever we want to. Peter has that idea, and Jesus pretty clearly says no, the cloud and all of that. But Jesus comes down. Jesus goes with his disciples always into everyday life. And in fact, for Andrew, who was not on the mountaintop, he will have this chance. Andrew will get to see Jesus alive and loose in the world just as we do. Because after that terrible Friday, after the silence of that Saturday, after that confusing Sunday and all of these mixed reports on Easter, Andrew with his fellow disciples will go back home. Go back to Galilee. Go back to regular life. And there they will see Jesus. Risen for the life of the world, alive and loose in the world. They too will get to see Jesus. And that's the way it is for us as well. God is transforming who we are because of this mountaintop experience. God is at work in our hearts and in our lives by our singing, by our fellowship, by our teaching, by the meal that He gives us, by the blessing of water, by the gifts of music that we enjoy, by this time to gather and encounter His Son. But Jesus doesn't stay here on the mountaintop. Jesus is always leading the way for His disciples. And it is so for you too. And as we go out from here, as transformed people of God, as you go home and to your regular life, everyday life, you will see Him. Jesus alive and loose in the world. Jesus who has blasted open the doors of death. Jesus who leads the way and has opened heaven to us all. Jesus who is risen for the life of the world. Jesus who shines like the sun because that's who He is. I wonder about Andrew because that's us too. We too are people for whom Jesus only makes sense after Easter. We too are people who will see Jesus alive, loose in the world, transforming lives. Thanks be to God.